Ali Aycıoğlu, Professor of History and Director of the Abbasi Program of Islamic Studies. Today we are delighted to host new friend, Professor Tunç Şen from Colombia. He will be introduced by Faisal in a second. Before we begin, let me briefly remind that Islam and Science series is a new speaker series co-sponsored by the Abbasi program. The program is the History and Philosophy of Science, History Department, and Middle Eastern Studies Forum. Each talk highlights cutting-edge research on how scientific knowledge was practiced, taught, debated, and exchanged across the medieval, early modern, and modern Islamic world or Islamic faith world, often through newly uncovered sources that challenge received narratives and reshape our understanding of science and scientific production of knowledge in Islamic faith world societies. Now I would like to invite Faiza Jazra to introduce our speaker, but let me introduce her. She will introduce Tunç, you will introduce me, Colombia,
Yeah. I'm the same.
Yeah. Faiza is a Ph.D. student in the history of science at Stanford University, whose research explores the intersections between the intellectual life of early modern Europe and Islamic world. She focuses on astronomy, cartography, cosmography, antiquarianism, and other forms of early modern scientific inquiry. She's a member of an Oxford-sponsored project, Arabic Books and Astronomy in 17th Century Oxford, which digitizes and curates Oriental manuscripts collection in astronomy held at the Bodleian Library at Oxford. In addition, Faiza is a co-editor of the Poetic Media Lab at Stanford's Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, CESTA, where she has been developing EpiConnect, a digital platform for community college instructors to collaborate and shape pedagogical research.
Today we are honored to welcome Dr. Tunç Şen to the second event of the Islam and Science series. Dr. Şen is a professor in the History Department at Columbia University. He is a specialist in the history of the Ottoman Empire and its many connections with the early modern world. Prior to joining Columbia University, Dr. Şen taught courses on Ottoman history and paleography and modern Middle East history at Leiden University. Dr. Şen earned his MA and Ph.D. in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago, where his advisor was the esteemed Ottoman historian Cornel Fletcher. Today, Dr. Şen will be speaking to us about his latest book, which is also his first book, and you can see the beautiful cover on the screen, Forgotten Experts, Astrologers, Science and Authority in the Ottoman Empire, 1450 to 1600, and it is published by our very own Stanford University Press, and you can purchase your copies afterwards. So Forgotten Experts examines how the expertise and authority of the group of occult scientific practitioners were constructed and contested in the early modern imperial context. These scientific practitioners, in particular the Munajims, served the Ottoman court with their expertise in mathematical, astronomical, and astrological sciences, and they distinguished themselves from other occult practitioners and esoteric specialists. And this work by Dr. Şen is significant because it recovers an otherwise unexplored history of scientific practitioners in the Ottoman court in the early modern period. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Şen.
It is such a privilege and joy to see my book appear as part of this series. And having this talk here at Stanford feels like bringing the book back home. And many thanks to you all for being here today. So I wrote a book about a group of scientific practitioners who lived and worked in the Ottoman Empire, specifically those attached to the imperial court during the long 16th century. I'm not a big fan of using long before centuries, and historians love having long centuries, but I think the long 16th century nicely encapsulates the period I'm mostly interested in, which is from the mid-15th through the late 16th century. These practitioners were known as Munajims, or müneccim in Turkish. And I chose to keep this original term throughout this book rather than simply calling them astrologers. Though, yes, the word astrologer still makes its appearance in the subtitle of the book due to editorial reasons. And the reason I use the original term instead of translating it astrologer is that the munajjims carried meanings and roles that went well beyond what we usually imagine when we hear the word astrologer today. When we think of astrologers, the image that often comes to mind is that of a crystal ball gazer, a clairvoyant, a charlatan, a kind of psychic. This negative perception certainly has some pre-modern roots, and I'll be happy to talk about that during the Q&A session if there will be any interest. But this crystallization of the negative image of astrologers largely occurred in modern times. So when you just quickly browse the New York Times archives today, you would come across news like the scientists dismissing astrologers as charlatans, or the interest in astrology depicted as the survival of medievalism. And medieval is, of course, a negative verb, as the fans of Pulp Fiction would nicely know. Or the famous story of the astrologer of Ronald Reagan and Nancy Reagan in the 1980s, who was, again, characterized as a clairvoyant, which apparently upset the astrologer. Who later wrote her own memoir saying that this guy, Donald Reagan, the chief of staff in the administration at the time, referred to me as a clairvoyant. And clairvoyants are mystics and psychics. I'm not anything like that. So in a way, my book is about recovering who the munajjims were, what they actually did, and why they mattered. Why they mattered as experts who embodied the fluid and evolving interplay of scientific knowledge, intellectual authority, and political patronage in the early modern context. So my definition of munajjims relies on the definition of some classical Arabic dictionaries of the 13th or 14th centuries, like Ibn Manzur's Lisan al-Arab or Firuzabadi's Al-Qamus al-Ruqiyya. These are the authoritative, highly circulated dictionaries of medieval and early modern Islamic law. And when you look into those dictionaries, you would come across definitions like those who look at the stars and compute their timings and movements, or a munajjim is characterized as someone who is informed in the signs of the stars, a compiler of almanacs, someone who measures the timings and movements of the stars to understand the conditions of the universe. So my definition of munajjims, and I sometimes use the word astro expert in the book, as someone who had the ability to make so technical mathematical and astronomical calculations and offer astrological advice for time-related concerns of their interlocutors. And at the heart of their work was the calculation and interpretation of time itself. In that sense, I like to think of them, as several other Renaissance historians like Anthony Grafton have put it, as masters of time. Because when we look at the textual output of the munajjims that I studied, you would come across different genres, all of which served to calculating and interpreting time for different reasons. Munajjims were compiling annual almanacs which contained information about calendar conversion tables, or showing what are the days for feasting and what are the days for fasting, what are the days to perform something, what are the days to avoid doing something, like going to a public bathhouse or cutting your hair. These almanacs also often include chronology tables showing the particular dates that on which a particular event happened. These almanacs also include prognostications, again based on the Munajjim's calculation of the horoscope. Horoscope meaning looking at the sky at a particular moment of time. Munajjims were also compiling birth charts, which are the detailed mathematical and astronomical computations and astrological interpretation, again, of a particular moment, and in that case, the moment is when the person was born, or when the conception took place. And Munajjims were also regularly delivering reports or memos in order to inform their interlocutors about the auspicious moments to start doing something. I'm going to quickly show you a few textual examples of the writings of the Munajjims. On the left-hand side, you would see an almanac page with the horoscope of the coming year, which is the spring equinox, the time when sun enters the zodiac sign areas. Okay? So at that particular moment, the Munajjim just looks at the tables in which he was finding data and making a computation. Okay? And based on that computation, he was providing astrological predictions. Okay? This yearly horoscopes are also complemented by monthly horoscopes, because every month the sun moves into a new zodiac sign. So what did that particular moment imply for astrological purposes? Another thing you can find in these almanacs is the projected date of either the solar or lunar eclipse. So if Munajjim calculated a solar or lunar eclipse to take place in that particular year, he was specifically pointing that out with an additional astrological interpretation of that day. And as I mentioned, chronology tables are often found in not all, but some of the extant almanacs. And when you look at the almanacs in a comparative fashion, you would be surprised how the layouts of these almanacs look alike between the European almanacs and the Ottoman taqweems. And the almanac genre was one of the best sellers in the European print market. Hundreds of thousands of almanacs were annually sold in European print market, in England, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, or other countries. But of course, in the Ottoman case, we only have a few manuscript copies of these almanacs. And we often come across the autographs, the signatures of those very people who compiled these almanacs. And here you see the same individual with the name Yusuf, who was once the timekeeper at the Fatih Mosque complex in Istanbul, and a few years later we start seeing him as one of the court Munajjims. And I'm going to talk about this unit of court Munajjims instituted in Ottoman bureaucracy from the late 15th century. And another textual example is the birth charts that the Munajjims were regularly compiling, especially for the members of the royal family. I only put here one page, but these birth charts are really colossal text. I mean, some of them were around 520 page-long text in which the Munajjim was first making all the detailed mathematical and astronomical computations and explaining why he was doing those computations. And then only in the last section of these colossal texts was he providing an astrological prediction as to the lifespan of the individual. And another important genre is these one-page long memos or the reports one can find abundantly in the Ottoman state archives from as early as late 15th century. And in these reports, you can find, again, the computation of the munajjim as to what would be a good time to start doing things. And that thing might be about embarking on a military campaign or constructing a building, including sometimes construction of royal mosque complexes. And these reports were taken seriously by the political decision makers. While I share here some general features of certain genres like taqweems, I really don't want to give the impression that these were timeless, unchanging texts. Quite the opposite, they evolved over time in terms of their components, in terms of their language, in terms of the scientific models they relied upon. And tracing these changes over time is one of the things I tried to do in the book. And we have so many visual evidence depicting the munajjims in business. Some of them are from pre-Ottoman times. This is from post-Mongol context. But the stock image of this munajjim is that individual holding an astrolabe, an instrument. That's where you can understand that the person at stake is just a munajjim. I don't want to bore you with some technical details, but I still find it important to say a few things about what kind of knowledge these munajjims needed. Okay? What did they have to learn in order to become a munajjim? And I can speak of a three-part scheme here. A munajjim had to know what the sources call the hay'a, literally meaning the configurations of the celestial bodies. The person needed to know ahkam, the decrees, literally meaning how to draw decrees out of the celestial configuration. So you can think of hay'a as astronomy proper and ahkam as astrology proper. A kind of basic division you can find in Ptolemy, the ancient astral authority, who wrote two books. One is the Almagest, the other was the Tetrabiblos, and one is devoted to the astronomical theory, and the other was devoted to the astrological practice. But the munajjim also needed to know the basic mathematics, basic geometry. Many of them also knew different natural sciences, including medicine. But the nujum part, which means the stars, is a bit tricky. Because it does not fully overlap with hay'a, it does not fully overlap with the ahkam. But nujum can be categorized as that broad category of the signs of the stars. Under that category, you have these particular genres that the munajjims really needed to excel in, including how to use tables. Tables meaning the data about the movements of the stars, or how to use specific instruments, astrolabes, quadrants, and so on and so forth, or how to compile those almanacs, the taqweems. In the astrological side of the story, again, these branches of astrological practice, each of them is very much tied to computing a specific time, whether it's the time of birth, whether it's the auspicious time to act, or whether it's the time when the customer or the patron asks the munajjim about something, whether that person is gonna get married. So munajjim was computing the time the customer was asking that specific question. That's called the interrogation of astrology. Again, I really don't want to bore you with these technical details, but I want to show you the very sophisticated and technical details of the disciplines that the munajjims were expected to know. But despite that sophisticated nature of the knowledge they had, munajjims really didn't enjoy any epistemological and social prestige. I mean, we have so many texts written against Munegims. Pretty hostile remarks about Munegims can easily be found in a broad range of genres, including the fatwas, the religious opinions of ulama, scholars, or some theological texts, or some ethical texts, political treatises, historical narratives, hagiographies, you name it. And it's very much similar to what the anti-astrological polemics were taking place in medieval or early modern Europe. And we should also add to that picture the Munegims' own self-doubts about their expertise. I mean, the Munegims are often characterized as worshippers of celestial bodies, but among the writings of the Munegims, I really couldn't find any text that can be really interpreted as such. Quite the contrary, Munegims often express the limitations of their expertise. They were basically saying that there are infinite amounts and permutation of celestial effects upon terrestrial events. There is no way for any practitioner to get to know about this full scope. So making errors is inevitable. Munegims themselves are simply saying that they cannot escape from making mistakes. But by way of these two methods, the syllogism and experience, one can make certain conjectures. But these are all probabilistic. It does not really entail any certitude. And this fact was acknowledged by the practitioners themselves. And they acknowledged the fact that unlike some other disciplines, their expertise was not part of this verification and tahqiq and tadqiq. These are the epistemological methods discussed in medieval and early modern Islamic belles-lettres. And again, Munegims often acknowledge their own limitations. So, where did Munegims or someone interested in becoming a Munegim learn all these sciences? Were they learning that in the madrasas, the colleges of law, as some medieval Islamic historians describe it? My answer to that question is no. I mean, madrasa really did not operate as an institutional site where an interested person could really learn the knowledge that the Munegims needed to learn. Yes, some madrasas were places where certain mathematical and astronomical disciplines were taught by specific instructors, but when it comes to compiling almanacs, when it comes to learning how to cast a birth chart or horoscope, I could not find any reference to any madrasa or a madrasa instructor offering that kind of discipline. The key institute here is the observatories, and we have to understand why the observatories were constructed in the first place. I mean, medieval or post-Mongol Islamic world witnessed to the construction of several observatories, including the Maraga Observatory in western Iran, founded by Nasruddin Tusi, or even more famous one, the Samarkand Observatory in the 15th century by Ulu Bey, the famous Timurid ruler, and his associates. But the observatories had specific functions, and the observatories were built in order to fix certain data problems that the Munegims were facing at the time. So revising that data with more systematic celestial observations was the primary motivation for establishing an observatory. In the Ottoman context, we only had one observatory established, and it was established in the late 16th century by this guy, Ph.D. And I'll be happy again to talk about him or what happened to that observatory, because that observatory, immediately after it was constructed, was demolished by, again, a fatwa, the religious opinion issued by the Sheikh of Islam of the time. We can speak of those mosque complexes, especially the royal mosque complexes, where there were these timekeepers computing the 5 daily prayer times, or what would be the first day of Ramadan, for example. But I don't necessarily see the muwakkil, timekeeper, and munajjim as two different types of practitioners. I mean, their expertise over all those sciences of stars pretty much overlap. And as I've already showed, some of the muwakkils ended up being court munajjim. So I'm not particularly happy with the historiographical stance over that artificial difference between the two. We can, of course, speak about those majlises, those parties or social gatherings through which those informal networks were established and maintained. But it's pretty difficult, I have to say, to trace how munajjims operated in those informal networks. The key institute that I want to focus on now, and I talked a lot in the book, is that imperial court office, or office without walls, as I put it in the book, that unit of court munajjims that seem to be established in the Ottoman court bureaucracy from the late 15th century onwards. So the particular historical setting of my book is the Ottoman Empire during the long 16th century. And this is a period when the Ottomans displayed some intriguing features in organizing expertise. While many other medieval and early modern Muslim-ruled polities employed munajjims to serve their rulers, none left behind as many and as varied records related to their presence and their work. And this abundance, I argue, stems from the Ottomans' remarkable ability to institutionalize expertise through a bureaucratic structure. Beginning in the second half of the 15th century, and especially under Bayezid II. And I think we should acknowledge this guy more and more. And I'm glad that there are more studies devoted to the importance of Bayezid II. At this time period, Ottomans created formal administrative units for a range of skilled practitioners, including the physicians, architects, engineers, astral experts, and so on and so forth. Each was headed by someone designated as the chief, and that person was named in Ottoman bureaucratic idiom as either the Sar, or Reis, or Bashir. I mean, these are all Arabic version and Turkish suffixes or prefixes identifying that individual as the top or chief person in that particular profession. But these chiefs were not only responsible for serving the Sultan in a private fashion, but they were also tasked to oversee their profession more broadly, evaluating qualifications, regulating appointments, extending sometimes services to the public whenever it was needed. In this way, the munajjims and other experts in the Ottoman context became embedded in a pretty structured, hierarchical, and public-facing bureaucracy. And I find that particularly interesting and important, and kind of distinguishing the Ottoman experience from other contemporary Muslim-ruled polities. And that's why I call that kind of framework as the empire of experts, or experts of of empire. But there is, of course, a broader question, or a set of broader questions here. Who was designated as chief? On what grounds and by whom? In other words, who counted as an expert? What did expertise really entail? How was one's expertise constituted, credentialized, contested, and by whom? And can we use these terms, experts and expertise, in the pre-modern, in the pre-19th century context, without being anachronistic? My definition of expert is pretty capacious than some modern definitions related to science, technology, specialization, or professionalization. I tend to view or define experts as a broad range of knowledge workers who operated within and across disciplines, who generated a substantial textual corpora. We should not really expect these people to be super specialized as what expert in our modern world entails. So physicians, the architect engineers, the managers, practitioners of various occult, scientific, or divinatory arts, or those people adept in specific madrasa disciplines, they can all be, I think, viewed as experts of their disciplines. Although I try to use expert and expertise as the conceptual framework of the book and more as an analytical heuristic device, we should also acknowledge that these terms were also the actors' original categories. I mean, you can easily find in Persian or Arabic or Ottoman Turkish certain words that also imply that particular individual's expert stance, like mahar or mahir, plural mahar, or hadiq, or ustad, or asaba, or habir. I mean, what do these words really refer to if they are not referring to some expertise claims? And I put here 2 examples, but you can find so many as to the claims of expertise by these individuals. And as I try to suggest in the book, expertise can be a useful framework, which is not as evasive and elusive even as what ilm really entails. I mean, when we hear the word ilm, so many things can easily be imagined, right? Ilm does not always refer to a science and knowledge. So by using expertise and by specifying what kind of expertise we mean, we can even narrow our conceptual framework. Oops, sorry. And I have to say that I don't approach expertise here as an objective attribute individuals inherently possessed. Rather, expertise, then as now, was about recognition. It was about making claims to authority. It was about how knowledge was validated or contested. It was about one's relationship to power. And we have so many other sources in the early modern Ottoman context to trace how individuals were credentialized as to their expertise. We have this genre called berat. It's an appointment letter, and I put here a berat provided to Taqiyuddin, who was the founder of the Istanbul Observatory. And the specific vocabulary used in the berat can tell us a lot about how his expertise was credentialized. Okay? You can find even examinations or some reviews, and I put here promotion into new reviews made in early modern Ottoman context. You can find reports in the Ottoman archives presented by some decision makers in the scholarly establishment, saying that, oh, this guy is so qualified, he deserves a promotion. Oh, he is not that qualified enough to become a professor. I mean, he should be demoted. Or sometimes you come across entries like, oh, this guy has expertise in jurisprudential matters and issuing fatwas, we should really promote him. So, what do these reports or account registry really tell us about expertise claims made both by the individuals as well as the more impersonal structure of the Ottoman court bureaucracy? And these claims about authority, these claims about expertise can also be traced by the autobiographical writings of these individuals. I put here one of my favorite protagonists in the book with the name Riyazi. He was one of the court munajjims at the time of Suleiman in the mid-16th century. And the pen name used by these people also tells a lot about their expertise claims. Riyazi meaning someone who was adept in al-ulum al-riyadiyya, the mathematical sciences. So the guy was so sure about his mathematical expertise over his peers. And he reflects on that in the many surviving writings he had. And here I just put one poetry, a few lines by him inserted into one of his Turkish translations of an Arabic historical book, where he says, having received this much wisdom and perfected my skills and mastery, I was left desolate in a corner of seclusion, removed from favor and gifts. Though I take solace in my being superior in skills, and here you can follow the originals in Ottoman Turkish, and I mean, this is not something I'm making up. I mean, I think we are allowed to use this notion of expert and expertise when it comes to somebody's claims about having the fazl, the virtue, or the knowledge or the skills. So, I'm coming to the last part of my talk now, and I'm going to suggest a few things about why expertise matters, or whether expertise does matter. Okay? I believe expertise allows us to come up with a more nuanced periodization, to trace the ups and downs of support for a particular type of expertise, or a particular group of experts, instead of treating science, that elusive, evasive term, in absolute notion. And that's what I tried to do in the book. I mean, my chronological arc from the mid-15th through the late 16th century is an attempt to trace the ups and downs of the support shown to these munajjims. So munajjims had good times, high times during the time of Bayezid II, but by the mid-16th century, the interest in their services, in their expertise was diminished, and there are several reasons that I'll be happy to talk about in the Q&A session. And the framework of expertise can also enable us, and this is very much related to that more nuanced periodization thing, to move beyond these historiographical and discursive extremes of absence, decline, or golden age and glory. I mean, the history of science in the Islamic societies was, for a long time, studied with respect to these two particular historiographical constructs. On the one hand, you would see, from a particular time onwards, science has declined, and we cannot really speak of any vibrant scientific community and practice. Adnan Adıvar, the Turkish historian of science in the first half of the 20th century, Aydın Sayılı, I mean, he has a fantastic book on the observatory in Islam, but he concludes that book with the causes of decline of scientific work in Islam, or some other well-known text, why Islam failed, or Islamic societies failed. And on the other hand, we have this glory, or unfounded glory, I have to say, James Pascal, I don't want to trash the book, I mean it's an important book, it's a good book, but there are some unfounded claims made by the author saying that by the 16th century, Ottoman astronomers were living their own renaissance as Europe was enjoying at the time. I looked at so many writings by the Munajjims in the 16th century, and I really had a hard time finding that kind of evidence that the author uses to say that the Ottomans were doing great at the time compared to the Europeans. Or this golden age rhetoric, it's still reproduced by publications like the geniuses of their ages. So expertise, I suggest here, can enable us to go beyond these discursive extremes of either decline or the golden age. And I put these images just for fun. The famous observatory of Istanbul, it's the picture. I couldn't count how many books devoted to history of science or intellectual history in the Ottoman or Middle East context uses the exact same image in order to prove that all sciences did not decline, or there was a great scientific achievement accomplished in both the Ottoman and the broader Islamic world. And I think, and this is, I think, one of the most important aspects of expertise as a framework, it enables us to look into those rivalries and competing claims of authority and prestige among different practitioners. These rivalries sometimes take place among experts within the same domain over attaining those positions in the bureaucracy. Or sometimes these rivalries occur across different registers of the same type of expertise. I don't want to use high and low here. I don't want to hierarchize the types of knowledge these people have, but those more technical, more learned type of people were not on the same ground with the more lay practitioners of the same discipline, and there was a kind of rivalry or clash of expertise among the two that one can trace. And obviously, there were rivalries of expertise across separate areas of knowledge. So expertise, I think, enables us to acknowledge those important nuances among practices and practitioners instead of simply flattening these nuances. So the term occult sciences, I mean, I like the term, I find it convenient, I find it important, but should we really use occult sciences as if it was a singular and homogeneous tradition? Or should we really trace some important nuances between both the epistemological pillars of different occult scientific practices and the expertise claims of these individuals? So I'm going to finish by showing you two documents. One is a long report by the geomancer who was pretty active at the court of Suleiman in the 16th century. This report was not signed by any individual, but I guess he was the geomancer with the name Haydar, and he was very, very influential in the policies of Suleiman. And when you look at this report, you see that the geomancer specifically targets the Munajjims, and he simply calls for the superiority of his expertise over the science of the stars. And I put here the originals for those of you who can read the Ottoman Turkish. Another relevant text, again from the mid-16th century. It's a treatise by a Sufi expert of ladderism, the science of ladderism, or ladder prognostics, the Jifri, as some of you might know. And in this long text, at one point, this guy just says that the decision makers, the political decision makers, should pay no attention to what Munajjims will say, nor should they appeal to what the geomancer should say. So if we keep using the occult science as a blanket term, we will have really hard time, distinguishing how these practitioners differ from one another. And on that note, I'm gonna just stop. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you for this wonderful talk. You mentioned that an observatory was demolished because of the religious degree. Can you tell us more about the tensions between religion and astrology in this time period, especially when you consider the blurry and often porous lines of different categories of alien knowledge? I'm curious to know more about how these religious authorities navigated these blurry lines, and what was their take on astrology?
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful question. Munajjims were among the most unwelcome type of practitioners, not just in the Ottoman context, but in the medieval and early modern Islamic context. As I briefly mentioned during my talk, so many anti-Munajjim polemics can be found in the writings of different ulama. So it was not that surprising for me why the founder of the Istanbul Observatory immediately received the censor of the Sheikh al-Islam at the time. What is more interesting to me is, yes, the observatory was demolished, but the office of court Munajjims, it remained intact up until the early 20th century. So we can't really explain the demolition of the observatory as purely a religious censor of astrological practice. I propose in the concluding section of the book several interpretive options to make sense of what happened really in the Istanbul Observatory. I think no one can really find any smoking gun evidence for the actual reasons of that. But we have to think about how the instruments used in the observatory, and these instruments were really colossal instruments. Some of them were 10 meter, 20 meter high, and they were easily visible from the outside. How were those instruments be perceived by the subjects of the capital at the time? This is something I raise as an argument, because 20, 30 years before the observatory was founded, another Ottoman court Munajjim proposed to erect some human-sized talismans across the city in order to repel the bubonic plague. When he proposed that, the authorities at the time immediately rejected that proposal, saying that, erecting human-sized statues around would really violate the pious feelings of these individuals. So maybe the observatory and the instruments were also conceived as threatening some pious considerations and sentiments of the individuals that the Sheikh al-Islam used as an excuse. Again, I'm offering it as an alternative. We can't know, because we don't have the report produced by the Sheikh al-Islam. We have only a reference to the report in some biographical dictionaries. But to cut it short, the authority of the religious scholars and the authority of the Munajjims, you can easily find so many other instances where those authorities clashed.
Jessica?
Thank you. I love your category of embittered experts. I think that's really wonderful. And I have a question about the sort of institutional, you gave us a sort of cultural and linguistic history, which I thought was really interesting of experts. And my question is about the institutional history. So my background is in French history. So when I hear the word expert, I immediately think of, Napoleonic civil service exams and things like that. And the credentialing, it seems like the credentialing process is part of what we think of since then, as when we hear about expertise. And just one more kind of detail of that is that I think in England for a long time, the credentialing process had nothing to do with the actual activity of the experts. So they're examined in Greek and Latin, but then they're making decisions about, public utilities. So there can be kind of incoherences in the credentialing process as well, that can be interesting. So I'm just curious about that aspect of the story.
That aspect was not as systematized in the early modern Ottoman context as it was systematized in the French context or even early modern China. The civic examinations for hiring people. I can't remember the historian of science about the early modern Chinese civic examinations. But if you can remember, what? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So it is not as systematic in the Ottoman context. So the evidence I tried to demonstrate today comes from here and there. I wish we had more, but probably it was a lot easier to find evidence about the madrasa system itself, because the examinations were more frequently conducted in the presence of, again, a committee of a few people testing whether the individual was knowledgeable in theology or Quranic interpretation or other religious sciences. But for the practice of medicine or astral sciences, the evidence was a little bit thinner, I have to say.
Thank you for this talk. I just want to invite you to elaborate on a couple of things you pointed to. One is, you said at the end, the diminishment of the status of these Renaissance in the 17th century, I think you said, or maybe late 16th. And then also kind of comparing their status and this institutionalization to other Islamic polities of the same period. I think you said it's exceptional, and so just wanted to hear more about that.
I tried to say that it's remarkable, not exceptional. I don't want to sound like an Ottoman exceptionalist, because we know that the Safavids, for example, also had the Munajjim Bashi, though we don't have the actual records. Or the Mughal context, what happened to the sources in Iran, what happened to sources in India from the 18th century onwards. We have to also take into that consideration. But still, I think the Ottoman experience is a remarkable, not idiosyncratic or peculiar. I'm not sure if I got the first part of your question correctly.
You said towards the end that their status diminishes sometime, I think, in the late
Well,
16th century.
there are ups and downs. So in the 18th century, for example, at some point of the 18th century, you would find again the Munajjims enjoying their time, just because there was one particular sultan who was very much interested in the services and the expertise of those people. So that's why I say we have to, narrow down our periodization. There is no such thing as, the astral experts always were in good shape or always in the bad shape.
Thank you. This was a really wonderful talk. So I have two questions. The first is, I'm curious about, you have that early kind of description of themselves talking about the kind of limits of their knowledge, right? This is conjecture, and so I wonder what that tension with expertise is for you, right? For this particular group of experts, let's say, who self-proclaim say this is kind of conjecture and we can't really verify. And then the second question is, I'm just curious about the tension between folk forms of astrology and this kind of bureaucratized court astrology. And, and it's especially interesting because you start with that Reagan example, right? So that is a court astrologer, right? Effectively, it's just that we no longer accept court astrologers in the United States. So I'm just, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Let me start with the first part. That's also something I question. Whether we should take their remarks at face value or whether they were trying to just save their faces by saying that, oh, don't take me too serious. I'm just, throwing out certain possibilities or probabilities, right? So maybe they were just face-saving attempts of these individuals, or maybe they were underselling themselves by making those kind of remarks. So I also have some mixed feelings about what was the intention of the Meningians when they were selling that, oh, our expertise also had certain limitations we have to acknowledge. As to the second question, it's so clear when you look at the writings by those, let's say, lay astrologers in the Ottoman context and the court astrologers, you can't find any computation, any mathematical computation in the writings of those lay practitioners, because they didn't really have the ability to make those computations. They still were producing horoscopes, but they were just saying that, oh, what's the name of the guy? Okay, let's compute the numerical values of the letters in his name. Suppose that the guy, his name was Muhammad. There is this gematria, the abjad system in Arabic. Each letter has a particular numerical value. So they were saying that if you want to calculate the horoscope of that individual, you have to make that simple arithmetical calculation. But that simple arithmetical calculation was not even similar to what the court Meningians were doing by computing all those celestial configurations. Again, I'm not putting them in a hierarchy here, but they were different. They were different, and that difference should really be acknowledged.
Thank you. So the tension between the ulama and experts is interesting. And ulama, the religious authorities or scholars, they can be in the bureaucratic setting, but at the same time, they have another kind of ground for legitimacy, right? They are financed by the wakafs, they're autonomous from the sultanic patronage sometimes. Religion by itself is kind of has an autonomy, right? Or, it's not under total sultanic control. So when they challenge those bureaucrats, say, they're coming from a different ground, kind of. So if you ask the same question for these people, okay, they're experts, they are bureaucratically structured, and their offices are bureaucratic offices, and they're under this kind of patronage, both patronage and bureaucracy, okay. But is there another ground that they rely on? Like, for instance, like public opinion. If they are very good what they are doing, they can get some public attention. So is there can we see another kind of, what's the word? Ground or
framework
that they can position themselves and rely on beyond sultanic patronage, do you think?
I think that's totally feasible as an interpretation. I wish we knew more about how the expertise of different types of individuals was perceived by the broader public. The founder of the Istanbul Observatory, what did he really mean to the residents of Istanbul at the time?
In general, when we consider public, we generally consider it as a reactionary, right? They are against the observatory. Can we also think about the opposite?
No, I'm not thinking of it as a negative, in negative terms. Maybe the public was super receptive of Taqiyuddin, and there was the talk of the town, and this concerned the ulama at the time. I wish we had the sources available. I couldn't find any traces of that kind of debate, but maybe new generations of researchers would find some new evidence. But that is totally feasible.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot from that presentation. I worked on astrology and almanacs in early modern England, so I was interested in your comparison. especially with the needs of the format, because the materiality was similar. I was curious, was there any cross currents of each people reading the other's almanacs, and was there any influence that we can trace?
Maybe Faiza would find something during her research on Greece and
Well, when John Reese travels, he actually has an almanac with him, and he's scribbling on it, so you take it with him. It was easy to carry, and like you said, it's like a public.
yeah, I mean the Latin word or Italian word used for almanacs, taqwimi, it's coming from taqwim. So in the 13th or 14th century context, I believe there was a close engagement with Islamic sources. But when it comes to the Ottoman impact, or whether there was any Ottoman impact on the writings of European almanacs, I haven't come across anything. But you probably have encountered already predictions about the Ottomans in the almanacs of Europeans, right? And there are.
Not always positive.
Yeah, of course, of course. But I haven't come across any particular transmission of Ottoman almanac and its contents into the European context.
Do you think the formatting similarities were just coincidental?
I mean, the use of tabular formats. The taqvim also entails the use of tables. I think they relied on similar sources. It can go back to pretty early times. But I don't think there was a contemporary inspiration between the Ottomans and the Europeans at the time. I just wanted to show it as a surprisingly similar example of the layout.
A few more.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I want to ask you about the self-image of these experts. So I guess this is somewhat of an anachronistic comparison, but when thinking about sort of the typical Enlightenment philosophe, they would see themselves sort of, when they inquire into the natural world, as sort of pursuing rational science, like trying to find out the truth of the matter, the truth of the world. And the second part of that is applying this to the betterment of society. So they had both a sort of epistemic standard that they were trying to uphold and a moral one. I'm just wondering, what was the self-image of these experts, this sort of, I guess, emerging class of court experts, in these terms? Did they have a sort of truth goal that they were pursuing? They derived any sort of moral legitimacy from the types of knowledge they were applying? So when they would sort of write these birth charts for people, did they see themselves as, you know, I'm helping these people out, I'm trying to help them deal with their lives? Or was it more sort of traditional sources of religious and government-related authority that they were trying to derive legitimacy from?
Well, thank you so much. I honestly have to think about this question because I don't have an immediate answer right now. But one thing I can say is that impressing the patron specifically was often the primary motivation. Sometimes they do that by explicitly saying it, like the example I tried to show as to the Riyazi guy. He was just saying that, oh, I'm the real expert here, why are you looking into others? And sometimes they do that, I mean, the intention of impressing the patron by showing the breadth and depth of their expertise in their writings. So the birth charts, for example, I said in my talk that they are colossal texts. Sometimes they are 300, 400 folios. Did the patron really need that kind of long text? He was mostly interested in learning about his birth chart, right? So why did the author bother himself to write 300, 400 page long text explaining all those technical, mathematical, I mean, those technical details would not be taken care of by the patron. But they probably served that primary motivation of that individual, showing how broad and deep his expertise was. So I think those expertise claims were less related to that public enlightening motivations of these individuals and more about impressing specific people who would grant those individuals those offices, those gifts, or those allowances. That's how I really see that. Thank you.
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between these experts in crafts and like craft making? Are they also making instruments, or how are they affording the instruments? Is the Muwakkil also a workshop? I'm especially wondering about clocks, like how they engage with clocks at all.
I was also very much interested in the clocks in the earlier phases of the research. And there is this general assumption that those Muwakkils were also craft people of these different types of clocks. I couldn't really find substantial evidence as to that. Sundials, for example, you can find in different mosque complexes, and some of these sundials have inscriptions about their craftspeople. I haven't found any trace of a Muwakkil making that instrument there, but they were using clocks for sure. Otherwise, we can't really expect them to make that kind of precise temporal calculations, because they were saying that, oh, you have to embark on the military campaign 4 hours and 20 minutes. I'm just making up these numbers right now, but they designate the specific hours and minutes, and these calculations can probably not be made without relying on the clock technology. But I haven't come across Munajjibs or Muwakkils as also craftspeople of the instruments.
Last question.
Now I have some pressure. I have 2 questions, and you can ignore one of them.
So,
first of all, thank you so much. It was brilliant, great delivery, amazing topic. I have 2 questions. One of them is if the institutionalization of, with the Munajjib Bashir, it seems like it's taking place in the context of broader confessionalization, and if it has anything to do with the state's kind of assert of control over knowledge in general, if it's related or not. And the second question I have is, I would love to hear more about the content of their writing. Like, what were the questions that they were asking? What was their primary concern? I mean, there is the patron-client relationship for sure, but anything that you found interesting, or and you kind of talked about the evolution of their writing too. Like, what are the ideas that you see that are changing?
Again, I have to think about these questions more deeply. I would tend to say no to your first question, but again, I should think about it. I don't see an immediate connection between what you say by confessionalization and bureaucratization and the creation of these offices and units. As to your second question, complaints are sometimes you come across, and complaints not about not being acknowledged enough by the decision makers, but complaints about not having access to instruments. So these instruments were pretty expensive things. Having an astrolabe, for example, it was not easily affordable by many Munajjibs, and I came across certain petitions sent to the Sultan or the Grand Vizier asking permission to use certain instruments in the palace treasury because they simply couldn't afford an instrument like an astrolabe. I find it interesting among those writings, other than those claims of authority or assertions of expertise of these individuals.
Well, thank you all.